If we come right up to the 60th World Summit of the UN, which took place in 2005, and this is just a picture of it, there was perhaps a more robust statement of support for the Universal Declaration. So during this summit, the outcomes document referred to the universal nature of the Universal Declaration being absolutely beyond question. So we have, if you like, the UN waxing and waning a bit on its endorsement of the Universal Declaration. Well, despite the language of universality in 2005 at the World Summit, we can see that these issues are still very, very sensitive and very significant. And I just want to give one example of this, and this is of the work of the Human Rights Commission, the Human Rights Council. This is just a picture of the Human Rights Council meeting. The Human Rights Council is the body that in 2006 was established to take over the work of the Commission on Human Rights. It's got a long history to those debates, and I won't go into those now, but it's a new body. Effectively, this is the engine room, the UN's engine room of human rights. Now, just last year, the UN Human Rights Council adopted a resolution that was actually introduced by Pakistan, which was called Combating Defamation of Religions. And it has many of the resolutions adopted by the Human Rights Council are adopted by consensus. They don't actually go for a vote. There's just assumption that everybody will basically agree on this. But unusually, the vote on this topic was, there actually was a vote taken. There was a call for a vote. And the vote was 24 states in favour of this resolution. I'll tell you a bit about it in a minute. 14 against it, and 9 countries abstained. And the force of this resolution was its basic purpose was to try to get countries to agree effectively to criminalise criticism of Islam. That's the bald bottom line. But the language of the resolution spoke about its deep concern at attempts to identify Islam with terrorism, violence and human rights violations. And there was, it was quite striking during the debates about this resolution. The countries that supported it were all drawn from a very strong lobby group at the UN, the Organisation of the Islamic Conference. And they basically, that group, basically control a lot of the numbers in the Human Rights Council. And it's striking in the debates, for example, the delegate of Pakistan who actually put up the motion really framed the debate very much as squarely one of Western rights to freedom of speech against Islamic values. So it was very striking so recently to see this debate pitched in those terms that we saw right back 60 years ago. Now, on one level, certainly the voting pattern gave some support to that interpretation because all the Islamic states on the Council voted for the resolution and all the Western countries on the Council voted against it. But that picture is made much more complex by the fact that Cuba, Mexico, the Philippines, Russia, South Africa and Sri Lanka also supported the resolution, so it was by no means just Islamic countries, while Guatemala, Japan, Korea and the Ukraine opposed it. And again, the abstentions were interesting. There were some Latin American countries, some African states and India. Now, there was a very interesting debate at the Council. Some countries saying, well, we really can't support it because although it's called combating the defamation of religion, there's only one religion that's actually referred to, and that is Islam. A number of countries saying they were concerned that such a resolution could be used to cut back on freedom of speech. Other countries were concerned by the lack of criteria in the resolution to determine when freedom of speech crossed over into unacceptable religious defamation. Now, I think looking at these debates, and the issue has actually continued on into this year, to me this is quite a troubling development. I think this resolution is a troubling development. First of all, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights already provides in Article 20, and this is a quote from it, any advocacy of national, racial or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility or violence shall be prohibited by law. So one response would be, well, what the resolution is calling for is to a large extent already protected in human rights law. And it seems to me one of the implications of this resolution is that it could be read as really preserving religions from criticism, particularly Islam. Now, of course, it's clear that there has been absolutely inadequate attention given to understanding Islam in the West. And there has been, we know this from our own press, widespread popular misrepresentation of Islam's spiritual teachings. But to me, the resolution was a very crude response to that problem. By implying that states have a duty to prevent criticisms of and debates about religions, particularly Islam, the resolution seems more intent on protecting religious ideas rather than the rights of individuals to religious freedom. So I think these type of objections to the resolution, I would suggest, can't be understood simply as an assertion of Western ideas of rights against Islamic values. First of all, they were articulated by both Western and non-Western countries. And second, of course, there are critical traditions within Islam that support discussion and debate on its precepts. And these traditions go back to the great Islamic philosophers of the Middle Ages. Now, that's one set of arguments, and these arguments that international human rights standards impose a false universality on different cultures, they're often associated with the non-Western world. But the point I want to make now is that, in fact, attacks on the universality of human rights are also very common in the West, although they're not usually pitched in those terms. Western governments regularly find international human rights standards as irksome and confronting as non-Western governments. For example, human rights principles have only made very limited inroads on the histories of race and sex discrimination on which our societies have been built. Another area in which many Western countries have resisted human rights norms, particularly our own, is that of migration. But the example I want to focus on is the conduct of the war on terror, the so-called war on terror, which has, I just use this as the image, this is one of these now quite well known, these Afghan war rugs that have been appearing in Afghanistan since the beginning of the so-called war on terror. But the conduct of this war has really led Western governments to resist the universal application of the Universal Declaration. Indeed, across the globe, the post-September 11 era has generated laws that attempt to reduce the threat of terrorism. These laws are premised upon the existence of a warlike situation, the idea that we're vulnerable to outside forces and that tough measures are necessary for the prosecution of the war. So we can really see, if we look across the world, particularly in Western countries, but by no means not only Western countries, these new wave of post-September 11 laws have typically four major features. And these are, first of all, they're very concerned with strict immigration controls. Secondly, they tend to restrict the due process rights of persons who are suspected of having some knowledge of terrorist activities. Thirdly, they create a regime without the safeguards of the regular criminal law to detain and question and try suspects. We see that extremely well at the legal regime in Guantanamo Bay. And finally, many of these laws also restrict the freedom of speech. One classic example of these, I think right here in Australia, and a law that I think we should be all very concerned about, are the 2005 amendments to the Commonwealth Criminal Code, which were enacted in the wake of the London bombings. These amendments introduced preventative detention orders, control orders, and expanded the definition of the offence of sedition to cover, for example, speech that urges assistance for countries fighting against Australia, even if Australia has acted illegally in invading another country. So strictly speaking, in looking at the new sedition laws, people who criticised Australia's invasion of Iraq, for example, and said that there was justified resistance to it, could come under the letter of those laws. Now, it seems to me, just looking, I'll spare you the details of these laws, but it's clear from looking at these new anti-terror laws in Australia that the provisions are either unnecessary in the sense that the offences are adequately covered in other laws, they're either disproportionate to the trouble that they are seeking to remedy, or they're too vague to be implemented correctly by enforcement agencies. These Australian laws, particularly the 2005 amendments, raise serious human rights questions. Both preventative detention and control orders are mechanisms that are inconsistent with the rule of law and with human rights principles such as the right to a fair trial and the right not to be arbitrarily detained. And I think that the sedition provisions introduced in 2005 are clearly inconsistent with international guarantees of freedom of speech. As the Northern Irish jurist Conor Gearty has argued, he made this argument in his amnesty lectures at Oxford 2 years ago. He pointed out that the war against terrorism is built on a division of the world into good and evil camps. The idea of human rights developed over the last 60 years since the Universal Declaration is precisely the opposite. It's that human rights attach to every person, regardless of whether we label them good or bad. And so the new wave of anti-terror laws completely undermine the force of the Universal Declaration by establishing categories of people who are unable to claim the full protection of basic rights because they have been tarred with the word terrorist. Gearty has pointed out, and this is a quote from his lecture, the moment that human rights discourse moves into the realm of good and evil is the moment when it has fatally compromised its integrity. For once these grand terms are deployed in the discussion, all bets are off as far as the equality of esteem is concerned. If we are good and they are bad, then of course equality of esteem as between all of us is ludicrous. These are not now any longer human beings simpliciter, but different kinds of humans, one good, one bad. It's the end of a quote from Conor Gearty. So I think these brief examples show that the universality of human rights remains controversial 60 years after the adoption of the Universal Declaration. Governments, whatever their particular character, Australia as much as Pakistan in this context, will stake out areas where talk of human rights becomes suspect. Culture then becomes an omnibus category for the areas governments want to preserve from scrutiny. In the post-September 11 world, the language of culture morphs into the language of exception and crisis. So then to conclude, I think the Universal Declaration, this is my last slide, this is such a nice one, I think, of Eleanor Roosevelt holding up the Universal Declaration a couple of years after its adoption. I think it's fair to say that the Universal Declaration, as I say, like any 60-year-old, is showing signs of age. It certainly contains some outdated language. For example, if you read it, you'll see reference to brotherhood through it and so on. And it's certainly another criticism, I think, that's quite validly made of it, is that it doesn't explicitly address the human rights of groups we now understand to be marginalised in most societies. For example, there was no reference at all in the Universal Declaration to the rights of people with a disability, nor to the rights of Indigenous peoples. But while it might be showing some signs of age, as I said at the beginning, I believe that the Universal Declaration remains also a youthfully radical document. It's extremely difficult to imagine that the economically drafted text of the 30 articles of the Universal Declaration could emerge from a 21st century United Nations process. I'd venture to say it's impossible to imagine that. Today, the formulation of the rights contained in the Universal Declaration would be much longer, they'd be much more qualified, they would be hedged by the language of exception and special circumstances. Everybody has the right to freedom of speech except the following people. So my point has been that I think we really have to hold on to the ideal of universality in the human rights area and resist attempts from all sides to water it down. Universal principles, I want to suggest, can accommodate pluralism and cultural diversity, but maintain a central ideal. I think the idea of universal human rights is valuable also in that it makes us scrutinise opposing claims of culture carefully. So, I suggest, whenever culture-like exceptions are proposed to human rights norms, we should ask, First of all, whose culture is at stake? Who are the interpreters of that culture? And what the political agenda behind the claim to culture actually is. So to be automatically suspicious about any attempt to say, yes, there might be universal human rights, but they don't apply in my particular situation. However, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to understand universality as pitted against particularity, because universal human rights standards can only make sense in particular contexts. To say everyone has the right to freedom of speech, to take that right again, is a universal ideal, but it won't make a lot of sense until it's actually applied to a local particular situation. And this, if you like, the flow between universal ideas and particularity is one that's very much present in the Universal Declaration still today. So I think we can understand universal ideals and particular application in a way as symbiotic, or perhaps actually part of each other. And there's a Belgian anthropologist, Marie-Bénédicte Dembour, and she's written these following words that I think really capture what I'm trying to say. She says, universalism cannot exist independently of particularism. It's in opposition to practices which appear abhorrent that universal norms are being set. And it's by reference to local particularities that these universal norms are implemented. So the reverse, she says, is also true. Particularism doesn't exist independently of universalism. As moral beings concerned with ethics, she says, we are not just beings of culture, we also respond to the call of universalism. But there's Seamus Heaney, who, the Nobel Prize-winning Irish poet, has written a beautiful piece on the Universal Declaration that was published earlier this year in the Irish Times. And he put that same point that I think Marie-Bénédicte Dembour was making, but as befits a Nobel Prize-winning poet, in a more poetic way. And he wrote, in his words, he says, the Universal Declaration is always there as a means of highlighting abuse, if not always as a remedy. He says it exists in the moral imagination as an equivalent of the gold standard in the monetary system. Even if its articles are ignored or flouted, in many cases by governments who've signed up to them, Heaney says it provides a worldwide system for the still small voice. Heaney has also said, and these are his words, that the boldness and buoyancy of the language of the Universal Declaration gestures so confidently towards what human beings desire that it fortifies a conviction that the desirable can in fact be realised. I really love that idea, and I think it's true if you read the language of the Universal Declaration. The boldness and buoyancy of the language gestures so confidently towards what human beings desire that it fortifies a conviction that the desirable can in fact be realised. And in this piece that Seamus Heaney wrote on the Universal Declaration, he also makes the argument that the Declaration has the capacity to offer redress. He's borrowed that idea of redress from the great French philosopher Simone Weil, and she argued that if we know in what direction the scales of society are tilted, her point was we must do what we can to add weight to the lighter side of the scale. And so in the same way, argues Heaney, the Universal Declaration adds this kind of weight and contributes thereby to the maintenance of an equilibrium, never entirely achieved, between individual rights and majoritarian politics. And surely, I think, this today, 60 years after its adoption, this is the great force of the Universal Declaration. It's certainly not able to prevent the abuse of human rights everywhere. We only have to look at the world around us today in Zimbabwe or Burma or in Guantanamo Bay. So it can't prevent the abuse of human rights everywhere, but it can offer a set of transcendent human commitments that can be used by us all to address imbalances of resources and maintain an equilibrium of power in our own particular communities.